Welcome to the Samuele Tini Show, where business, innovation and sustainability converge to drive progress. Are you ready to uncover solutions shaping our future? Let's dive in.
Welcome to a new episode. Today we are going to discuss again climate. We are going to discuss policy, and we do it with an expert that she will tell us more. She's calling us from the other side of the continent. So we are going to West Africa today. I'm very pleased to have a climate resilience and industrial development policy research and advisor, Soha Benchekroun. Soha, it's such a pleasure having you today at the podcast.
Many thanks, Samuele. Thanks for the invitation and for having me. Happy to contribute to your platform with my personal views.
And so, you have been at the very high level, negotiations, discussion, advising. But before that, you are a citizen of Africa. We want to understand, and you said in your bio, I was touched when you say aspiring citizen of Africa. So can you tell us a bit more about your journey?
Thank you very much, Samuele. So an aspiring citizen of Africa, this started probably when I decided to leave France to go back to the African continent, to Guinea-Conakry. It was in 2022. I had also the chance since then to live and work in North and now East Africa. Aspiring to be a citizen of the continent is, I think, mainly about having great respect and humility toward this continent and its people, and trying to always take their perspective, the perspective of the people. Culturally, it is about being curious to know, to experience this continent and identify with its different cultures. Curiosity to, let's say, taste tieb, couscous, or ugali, to take a boda boda in Kenya, in Rwanda, or a taximoto, we call it in Guinea, and enjoy the experience in all these places. Although one could feel a little safer using the Rwandan motorbike, as the driver gives you a helmet. Yeah, but same for all kind of ingenious, vibrant and loud beauty of this continent. Sorry for those visitors who find it too loud to their liking, but yes, this is a very loud continent. A continent one can be proud to be a citizen of. Part of citizenship also is being annoyed when you see foreign interference. Western interference is probably more accurate. Western interventionism is a painful thing to see for an aspiring citizen of Africa. So yes, a big part of our problems come from neo-colonial mindsets and practices. That said, some of our own do take anti-African stances and fight their fellow Africans sometimes. That's equally painful to witness at all levels, especially in spaces that are meant to defend continental interests. So, I believe Africa needs more people busy creating systems that work for the continent rather than cracking systems to somehow ensure their personal continuity within them. So you asked me about what I meant by African citizenship. Well, these things come to my mind. Take also the passivity of some of us Africans. That's quite deplorable as well, in the sense that perpetuating the status quo is not helpful. But it gives hope. It gives hope to see that at all levels, there are also brilliant and brave citizens of Africa who are shaking the lines, who work for and celebrate social, economic, industrial progress wherever it is on the continent. Being happy for fellow African countries when they succeed in something. Take soccer, even if this shouldn't be a major concern for us at all, actually. Being a citizen of Africa means, this might seem like an unusual statement, but it means to me that you can be Moroccan, but be happy that Senegal wins some cup, or the other way around. It doesn't matter. We're brothers and sisters of the continent, creating and fueling unnecessary rivalries. That is precisely what the imperialist machine has been tirelessly striving to do since ancient times. So no need to add more. Perhaps from a policy perspective in my daily work, being a citizen of the continent means trying to adopt an African lens, in the sense that while certain policies may be good for a country because they align with its national circumstances, they might not be relevant for other African countries. So it wouldn't be very fair to make it an African agenda. Being an aspiring citizen of Africa simply means, in my view, believing in a a Pan-Africanist project that can change the life of millions of people across Africa, and pursuing it in a loyal manner that goes beyond any personal, any career interest, or any small individual level consideration.
And thank you, Soa. And then for your passionate and really statements. And I really want to touch on this. You discuss about interference. And one of the things that you have been involved is the Green Climate Fund, the negotiation, and the discussion. So maybe I will ask two questions. The first one in 10 seconds, what is the Green Climate Fund? And the second one, which are the moments, as of course we cannot discuss about the negotiation, but as somebody, as a citizen of Africa, which are the moments that at the table that made you angry, hopeful, or other? And my question is really why the negotiation space is sometimes, especially at this high level, disconnected from the realities on the ground and the reality space of our continent.
The Green Climate Fund is a multilateral climate fund. So there are other MCFs, multilateral climate funds, but this is one of them. Perhaps I can focus my answer on the UN climate negotiations. I think these are becoming you mentioned it. You mentioned the disconnect from reality on the ground. And I think that's true. This is becoming like a mechanism that spawns new processes as naturally as it breathes, simply to keep growing, becoming like a giant without a real purpose or direction. So this is how I see it from a relatively short experience in the space, but long enough to say this quite confidently. And I believe some of my colleagues would tend to agree with this interpretation. So it's criticized both from within and from outside. The issue with climate negotiations for Africa, in my view, is that there are fundamental things for the continent that will never be on the table. Show me a negotiation room where we mention infrastructure development, or a room where value addition and industrialization are on the agenda. Yet these are the foundational pillars that will build the continent. This is actually the climate and economic resilience of Africa and other parts of the global south, yet no room to talk about this. So we can meet every year, even twice a year. As we speak, you have the Bond Mid-Year Conference that is happening. Then you have the COP later in the year. So we can meet to demand finance, especially finance to adapt to the impacts of climate change and to repair the loss and damage caused by a crisis that is not of our making. Yes, on principle, this is climate justice. The issue is that we did this for 30 years and we could continue doing it for 30 more years until COP60. The question I ask myself is this contributing to lifting our continent from poverty and boosting our economy in some significant manner? I have serious doubt about it. One can seriously question the effectiveness of these climate talks, considering the very meager outcomes it yielded, to be frank, over the years. So yeah, we can continue using money to travel, organize meetings, participate in dialogues and negotiations, which are often much more about process and bureaucracy than substance. We can come up with new work programs, new roadmaps, but obtain the very same results. Then at the end of the COP or subsidiary bodies express how did we are with an unfair and overall sterile process, but then do it all over again the year after. So you can think of the call for climate justice like the call for justice for the wrongs of colonialism or slavery. It's somehow the same nature of corrective justice that we need in the face of climate impacts. Yes, there are deep historical iniquities because of the colonial past. We agree that there must be reparatory justice. We must be compensated for long years of exploitation of our lands, of our resources, of our people. But have we seen any compensation so far? None. At least none of significance. So yes, the call for reparations must continue in this case. But is it where significant socioeconomic change will come from? I doubt it. If you draw the parallel with climate negotiation, these processes will in some way continue. Now we're talking about reforming the governance of COPs, as it is becoming so complex that everyone gets basically lost in the process. This is, as I see it, this is mostly keeping our countries busy. I mean, sometimes it can result in some small incremental step in the right direction. But to be honest, I don't think this is where real development will come from. This is far from addressing what the continent really needs.
And thank you for your perspective. Very critical, and I think I want to go deeper on that because it touches also one of the topic we discussed a lot. There is a lot of talk about sustainability, and in your writing you say a lot. I mean, sustainability for who? And so in the African talks, as you say, which are the priorities? You mentioned infrastructure. We have jobs. We have a rising number of youths. We have development, and then we have poverty eradication. Since we still have a lot to do on that side. So which is the, let's say, the green growth narratives and then the things that are discussed globally, can they be applied to the African context? Where they go wrong and where they go right?
I think that's a very important question. And one of the issues with these green growth narratives and of the global climate governance is that it makes us think that the solution will come from outside. It never did, but it succeeded keeping us locked in an aid mentality. But let's be realistic. Developed countries are cutting ODA, official development assistance, multilateral climate funds, and one example is the GCF, but you have others, are heading towards negative growth replenishments. The US withdrew beginning of this year from the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, completely disregarding its responsibility as a historical polluter. You take some developed countries, they even sign contribution agreement, but then withdraw or say that they do not intend to meet the full amount they have committed to provide. Despite the moral obligation to provide funding to developing countries, despite the advisory opinion issued by the International Court of Justice, ICJ, in July last year, stating that countries have legal obligations to address climate change under international law. You take UNEP's 2025 Adaptation Gap Report. It states that, quote, adaptation financing needs in developing countries, the needs are 12 to 14 times as much as current flows, unquote. That's a huge gap. So this is a situation we are in and worsening with time. We can't rely on international funding anymore. Another issue is that this scarce funding that comes from external sources tends to be directed towards non-priority matters in many cases. For instance, mitigation-focused agendas. Let us be clear. I come from a country, Morocco, where, yes, we have solar and wind, but no, decarbonization should not be a priority at the expense of the country's primary environmental challenge, which is the water crisis. And you see the structural drought, very recent tragic floods. That was a reminder of the magnitude of adaptation needs. So let's not forget that if massive investments in decarbonization can create relatively few jobs and have limited social returns, climate adaptation, on the other hand, is directly tied to people's livelihoods, to their physical security, to water supply security, to the reduction of regional inequalities. Very quickly, to get back to the continental level. In that article you mentioned from 2023, I guess, I tried to argue that sustainable development in the continent is industrial development. We need an industrial revolution in this continent that will translate into socioeconomic benefits for the people. We need big refineries, we need continental steel industry and other strategic industries, mega industrial projects, railways. For that, we need to resort to all available resources, including fossil fuels. You cannot put such industrial capacity in place using solar and wind only. So with our level of current historical and current global greenhouse gas emissions as a continent, as Africa, we shouldn't even be asking ourselves whether we should emit or not. Quantitatively, rationally, it doesn't make sense. The ball is in their court, not ours. And as of current logistics, the way society functions today, it is well established that industrialization and decarbonization come as a trade-off. In this case, we must be strongly biased towards industrialization. We could try to design systems so that they are more readily let's say, decarbonizable in the future. But this shouldn't be a priority. Perhaps in 20 years, when Africa starts emitting, we can then start reconsidering this trade-off. But now it should be, in my view, it should be a non-issue for us. So let's stop criminalizing our own industrial development. We're not doing ourselves a favor. Obviously, historical polluters who continue to build coal capacity today are not in a position neither to criminalize our industrialization. We don't need validation from any country. And if funding from certain stakeholders is conditional, then perhaps it is not fit for purpose. We then need to look for funding that aligns with our priorities.
And this is a very strong statement that sometimes even other guests, we discussed that, some other guests, they are more to, let's say, the decoupling or now, but I really appreciate that, industrial base is important, and it's very difficult to compete with markets, either from, using all terminology, develop or developing. There are some countries that are a size of a developed economy, but they're still calling themselves developing, especially in Asia, I would say. So that, and competition is not easy, especially for African country and African industrialization. So since you are putting on that infrastructure, industrialization priority, it's really sharp. It's a strong statement of yours, and we really need that. And we have seen also, for example, in the wake of this crisis in Iran, we don't have capacity to refine oil, and then so we don't have oil in the country, even though some countries are producing it. So what a fair deal in this climate negotiation, this discussion, go green, don't go green, whatever, would look like for you. So what are you proposing to really change a bit the conversation? Which is the path we can use?
You mentioned oil, and that's an important point. I'll get back to that in a minute. But just to continue a little bit on this issue about the current aid-oriented logic, and then I'll get back to your question. So the issue with that is that it perpetuates policies and cultures of dependency, domination, and inequitable cooperation. And a lot of this go green discourse is, whether we want it or not, anchored in this logic. So another feature of external funding that we mentioned is that it is getting structurally unreliable. Take external capital. Its objective has always been channeling the funding through external institutions, their own institutions. So the over-reliance on foreign investment is not helpful, actually, not doing ourselves any good. As also this whole global climate governance is anchored in neoliberal logics, it will tend also to promote false solutions that mainly benefit some foreign private sector, for example, thus diverting our attention from what really matters. Risk. Systems that rely on the dictates of risk rating agencies, and these systems it's mainly the systems that are being used. They tend to penalize countries based on questionable or politically biased criteria. That's also why the Africa Credit Rating Agency was created in 2025, last year, as a continental initiative aiming to give a fairer risk pricing and representation of Africa's creditworthiness. So we need, I think, fundamentally to get rid of this aid mindset that is not taking us anywhere. Foreign financing could complement our own internal endogenous solutions, but it can never play a central role in our development. What Africa needs, above all, is regional integration, African-led infrastructure development, industrialization, and domestic value addition. And the climate discourse for the continent can only be useful for Africa if it is approached through these lenses. In that other article, I am seeking to advocate for a climate adaptation, infrastructure, industrialization nexus. Because when you see the cost of pit-to-port models, the cost of not industrializing, basically, you take the delta, the difference between the value of processed and non-processed minerals. It's already very high. The fact that we are actually somehow exporting jobs that would have been created in refineries, in factories, in supply chain ecosystems. Take also the cost of Africa's import dependence, import of processed goods. it is rising. These are all missed opportunities that represent a significant cost and expose the continent to global shocks. And you mentioned one example of the recent war. African-led, when I say African-led, that means also with African capital. And this is possible. African industrialization should be pursued mainly by African industrialists. And we start seeing interesting examples like Dangote, who make, examples of industrialists who make things happen, bring in a new mindset as a developmental industrialist who also has the power to bring countries together around common industrial projects, of which they can have common ownership. That's very important. The ongoing discussion about the oil refinery in East Africa, if you heard about it. So that's a good example of what Africa needs, investing in sub-regional and regional integration and African self-reliance. That is what sustainability should look like. I'll give very quickly two quick other examples of countries. A country taking its destiny in its own hands, and one where I had the chance to live and come back 2 years after to witness what promises to be the start of an industrialization process. So there are basically emerging clusters for the local refining of bauxite, but also other minerals. It's Guinea-Conakry, and so they have this Simandou 2040 program. And I think by working to enforce local transformation agreements, Guinea is really shifting away from outdated patterns of colonial and post-colonial extractivism, and also, the inequitable exchange and revenue leakage that comes with that. Another country that is working to channel mineral revenues into long-term development is Burkina Faso, with the creation just last month in May 2026, they created a sovereign fund, le Fonds Souverain Minier d'Investissement, to capture surplus revenues from the country's mining sector, and gold actually in particular, and redirect them toward industrial projects, toward strategic infrastructure and economic transformation, which is a very important and commendable initiative. You have other examples also, including Uganda, that completely banned the export of raw materials, etc.
And my subsequent question on that is that the famous South-South, the discussion about South-South cooperation and then Pan-Africanism, Global South has been in the mouths and in many conferences, but sometimes we have seen now the scenes in South Africa or other countries. Sometimes cooperation is not that yet there. So maybe is in practice not that there. So it might be declarations or some ideas. So which kind of South-South cooperation really can drive this continent's economic transformation for you? And what needs to change?
Well, South-South cooperation, I think, is no longer optional. And as you said, it must go beyond declarations. We need to work with serious Southern partners with whom we can have win-win relations. We need to reflect on the potential for Pan-African and South-South synergies between countries that actually share similar priorities in terms of local value addition and economic sovereignty consolidation, especially in this increasingly uncertain geopolitical context. Of course, regional cooperation among ourselves first is a priority. But I would like to focus on the example of China, a country I had the chance to visit earlier this year, a country that leapfrogged as well in many ways and became today an economic superpower with an impressive level of infrastructure. So China is the biggest export market for the Africa's unprocessed minerals. But I think it has also the potential to be a partner for meaningful domestic value addition, especially when agreements are carefully negotiated and equitable. When we negotiate outcomes in terms of fiscal revenues, in terms of industrial development, etc. Why is that? Why China? First, because it is a historical investor in African infrastructure. China is building ports, bridges, foundational infrastructure on the continent. It's very difficult to find, non-Chinese stakeholders doing railways and doing large-scale infrastructure in the continent in Africa. At the same time, I think they can invest in climate-resilient infrastructure, which is very important to us, resilient to floods, to other climate shocks. More importantly, they can accompany this drive of many African countries to create value locally. Chinese, like many others, I think, start to see that Africa is learning from history and no longer wants to export pineapple and import pineapple juice, which was a shocking example I witnessed in West Africa, where you have the best pineapples in the world, or export raw cacao and import chocolate. Same thing for minerals. So in Guinea, in 2025, I visited the construction site of the China's company, which is building the country's first alumina refinery since its independence in 1958. It's the SPIC company. This is an important step forward that other mining companies from other countries failed to achieve in Guinea. That's an example. The Chinese do business in Africa. The business might work out great or maybe not as well as one can hope in some cases, but they don't interfere in African politics like Westerners do. So I see it as an important difference. Of course, when we speak about China, it's a variety of factors. The question remains how balanced and mutually beneficial relationships can be built, how minerals can be used, how Africa can use minerals to negotiate technology, know-how, skill transfer, build engineering capabilities, and drive structural economic transformation. But yeah, overall, in many respects, I believe that cooperation with China can respond to Africa's needs in a more, let's say, targeted and priority-oriented manner compared with a Western cooperation.
And the discussion on China, can go along. There is usually, as I always say, it's not a black or white. I mean, there is a lot. And also China is not a monolith. Sometimes China is not the Communist Party, is not the ideology of Xi Jinping, but there is also an history and there is also more diversity and dynamism. And of course, I agree with you. China has learned to build, which I think maybe many society have not learned, or they have not learned, especially the so-called the West. So it's a very good in building. It's very good in modernity. Of course, it has its own flaws. And sometimes, especially in the last few years, has been cracking down on many of the things. So it's and especially with the new, let's say, the third term. But of course, I agree with you. It can be a very good partner, especially if it can foster industrialization. And I think more and more, even other partners traditionally has put the industrialization rather than just fostering, the export model that sometimes an overcapacity, because that is sometimes the trade-off that we really need to be discussing. And one of the things is I want to go now discussing a bit about the new spaces. There is a new hype about techno solutions that they coming from left, right, and center. I mean, even our politician, we went to a benchmarking in China, we brought this technology. We went to a benchmarking to Israel, we brought this technology. We went to a benchmark in America, we bring this. So where do you see this, especially with the digital climate tech and all this space, that this techno solutionism without understanding the reality can bring?
Yeah, I think some live under the illusion that market-based green tech will save the world, or at least they try to make the world think that it is true. You can do wars in all impunity, enable extractivism, cause debt to skyrocket, destroy biodiversity, exceed all planetary boundaries. But then, no worry, green tech is our savior. Well, no, this is not how it works. And in the global climate response, we often hear of so-called innovative high-tech solutions, which are not necessarily relevant nor contextualized solutions. An example is carbon capture or air to water, atmospheric water generation. Often the technical and economic viability of these solutions are questionable. They are presented as silver bullets to some of our countries. It's good for the private companies that sell these technologies, but yes, there is room to question some green tech solutions. And beyond specific technologies, we should realize that the solutions are not only or necessarily technological. For example, dealing with structural drought cannot be limited to a purely technical approach, such as relying on desalination. We cannot go against nature and then expect techno fixes to repair the socio-environmental damage caused. The same is true for many mechanisms rooted in market logic. Was it Einstein who said that problems cannot be solved with the same mindset that created them? Instead, I believe we need to redefine our relationship with water, in this case, wisely recognize the aridity of our land, and build water governance models and food policies accordingly. So part of the solution comes from revaluing our traditional and processed and local food habits. Do we really need superfoods that are grown thousands of kilometers away, like quinoa? Don't we have local superfoods that are far more accessible? And this comes also with leveraging our traditional knowledge systems, the knowledge systems of smallholder farmers that are often frugal with inputs in general, with water. And no agroecological shift can be made without this.
And this is, I think, also you're talking about Africa and ingenuity, and I want to talk a bit more about that. So, you wrote and discuss about your book, Ingénieuse and Talentueuse Afrique. So it's the made and the talentos and ingenious Africa. So can you give us some example of this made in Africa and design in Africa innovation that really makes you passionate?
Well, a classic example everybody will use, and no wonder that there were case studies written on that, is M-Pesa, turning mobile phones into banking tools, which is per se a revolution in the banking sector. I mean, I use it daily. I use it many times a day, actually, when I am in Nairobi. And from your expression, I can imagine that you as well, Samuel. Yeah, I mean, there are hundreds and thousands of examples even of, made in Africa innovations like M-Pesa. Some are described in this book. I co-coordinated indeed. But I think we should not limit ourselves to this conception of ingenuity. Africa is not only, frugal and street smart, but much more than that. And this is what I seek also to convey as well in the chapter I drafted in the same book. There are other ways of thinking ingenuity, I think. One of them is designing decolonial mindsets and systems in all aspects of life, especially decolonization of knowledge. Like finding ingenious ways to promote African languages, cultures, philosophies, and indigenous knowledge systems. I'm thinking of the legacy of Wa Thiongo, the Kenyan professor, who is seeking authentic expression, so he rejected the colonial linguistic framework he had long opposed and wrote the book in his native language, Gikuyu. I hope I'm pronouncing well. Doing politics differently is also part of ingenuity, honest leadership that is shifting the lines, that is interrogating the status quo and finding ways to break free from debt dependence, from IMF and Bretton Woods dependence that strangles the continent. Young leaders in the Sahel, for instance, and others that are showing a new face of African leadership and ingenuity that is trying, sincerely working towards or to make the continent truly sovereign, emancipated, and resilient. The way is long, of course, but the attempt is there, and that is important. So once you have this kind of governance, this will automatically create the right ecosystems to unlock African ingenuity, to give space to young startups, etc. Another aspect, perhaps, that comes to my mind when it comes to this discourse around ingenuity is not consuming technologies, but producing them and becoming technology leaders. And not all technologies, I mean, those that are relevant, not necessarily the trendy ones. So let's recall that uninformed consumption of AI, for instance, like any other tech, can be alienating.
And that is true. Sometimes we consume more, and, especially talking about our countries, we consume social media or gaming produced by the big corporation of social media in China or the West or any other. And then I think we need to produce more content and more work ourselves in a way. And I want to discuss that, how we can foster that. If I have to put my practitioner hat, discussing about, we are working at the grassroots level. So if you have to advise, somebody that is working at the grassroots level and discussing with ministries, community, which are really the move that you will see practical, in practice, that we can align climate action with really development outcomes, really to change also these mistakes that commonly donors and implementing partners do it. as you said again and again.
Absolutely. I think the main issue is the misalignment between donor priorities and the broad investment priorities of the continent. Donor funding will usually go to short-term relief, to band-aid solutions, like post-disaster, for instance, versus building resilience in the long run. Providing shelters or distributing cash or flower bags is not like investing in robust infrastructure that will last. Also, donors tend to have project-based approach, like sporadic pilots, not scaled, not necessarily covering the geographies in need or most in need, rural areas, for instance, and usually it causes regional imbalances. Also, another issue that I see is the use of financing instruments that are only worsening the debt crisis our countries are facing. The majority of emerging instruments, sometimes called alternative, new, or innovative, you heard a lot about that recently, are nothing more than debt in disguise, actually. So that is something we have to be mindful of. Of course, there are other issues like the lack of cross-sector integration, climate planning not necessarily integrated with agriculture planning, with infrastructure planning, etc.
And this recall one conversation we had. No, it is just to quote a guest that was before from Kenya, discussing Kenya. So we don't need more sexy startups and sexy app, but we need cold chains, we need roads, and we need power to really unlock agricultural development. So it was so that is the thing. And to get for the last question, coming to an end to the episode, everybody's talking about the African century, which is true. If you look at demographic, of course, the continent is vibrant, and so we want to see how this can become in reality. Which are the specific and things that you can tell in 5 years that it will shape its own century and not be just shaped by other forces, geopolitical forces from west or east or any other?
Definitely, for me, that speaks to infrastructure systems, again, local beneficiation, connecting regional value chains. What Africa needs is ecosystem building, manufacturing hubs. We need to produce things in factories, then trade them among ourselves with the support of the African Continental Free Trade Area once properly operationalized. We need to build foundational infrastructure, robust power, water systems, ports, and that are not only enclaves in mining projects, but widely used by the population and various sectors in the economy. Africa, you spoke about agriculture. Africa needs to capacitate its smallholders in rural areas and protect them from global trade distortions and cheap subsidized imports from abroad. That's an important conversation as well. If the climate discourse can support in this direction, in direction of infrastructure, industrialization, empowering smallholders, etc., fine. Otherwise, it is a loss of effort and energy. So to be blunt, our resources are limited. We have no interest whatsoever in distracting ourselves from what matters. Of course, another aspect is the possibility to travel in the continent, visa-free for Africans. And that's a great initiative that African countries are now increasingly taking. But flights have to follow. We need to have direct and cost-effective flights between African countries to facilitate trade and business. And we need to leverage our capital. That's also an important part of the conversation. African organizations, African regional development finance institutions, homegrown resource mobilization, and that is possible. To finish with, perhaps there is a vital necessity for African countries to diversify regional and global geopolitical alliances, to intensify South-South trade and cooperation, and seriously work towards self-sufficiency, so as to protect their strategic autonomy and not end up trapped to the whims of interventionist powers. I think we need good, balanced partnerships, especially southern ones, and not outdated paternalist relationships.
And thank you, so for your perspective and your discussion. I'd say there is a lot of food for thoughts, and really a very strong statement. If I have to summarize, is that industrialization and self-sufficiency and really cooperation between South-South, so integration and regional integration. So thank you so much, Soha, for your wonderful episode.
Many thanks, Asante Sana. It was my pleasure. Grazie.
Are you satisfied after this wonderful episode? Let's continue together our sustainability journey.